Good afternoon, everybody. We are very happy and glad to have you joining us today in the second ICARUS training webinar, which is titled Mobility Under Uncertainty, Trends and Scenarios in a Post-COVID-19 Time. This is the second webinar of a series that we hold thanks to the Italy-Croatia program, which has also funded the ICARUS project. With this webinar, our aim is to bring knowledge to public authorities and to help them understand the field of transport, mobility, and intermodal solutions. In particular, the ICARUS project fights against problems generated by the massive use of private cars, and it works by introducing solutions which are based on technologies to adapt smart mobility in a digital world. We have a number of pilot and testing activities going on in Italy and Croatia. And we also work to trigger behavioral change. So we try to use mobility as a service, the mobility as a service concept to help within this transition. You can also learn about more about ICARUS by going to our website or by connecting with us through our social networks. My name is Eleonora too, and I work for the ITL Foundation, and I'm also the coordinator of the ICARUS project. And today, joining me, I have Patrick Rerat from the University of Lausanne, and Lucio Rubini, who works for Venice International University. They will have the chance to present themselves in just a couple of minutes, but before we start, let me do some housekeeping first. So today's webinar is going to last for 6 to 8 minutes, and it's going to be structured in 2 parts. So Patrick will give a presentation first, and then Mia and Lucio will bring him some questions and we'll discuss a little bit with him. This webinar is recorded, and the recordings will be uploaded on the YouTube channel of the ITL Foundation. And you can also download the slides and obtain the slides from the ICARUS website. As participants, you will be muted throughout the webinar, but you have the opportunity to ask questions by using the chat function that you should be seeing in your window. And once you ask questions, we'll forward them to Patrick at the end of this presentation, so you can also get some live answers from him. Yeah, and that being said, again, a very warm welcome to everybody, and I will leave the floor to Lucio and Patrick.
Good afternoon to all of you. Also from my side, my name is Lucio Rubini from the Venice International University, which is a partner of the ICARUS project and in charge of the organization of this training path and the organization of the webinars for the project. We are very glad to host today Professor Rerat from the University of Lausanne, which is one of the members of our consortium of the Venice International University. He is a full professor in geography of mobility, and he was also visiting researcher in several European universities, such as the King's College London and the Athens City University of Hamburg. His topics research is on residential mobility and everyday mobility in the perspective of sustainability. His latest publication have addressed utility cycling, teleworking, car-free living, as well as the renewal of residential attractiveness of the cities. So the agenda for today's webinar is that I will leave the floor to Professor Rerat for a first keynote speech for addressing the topics and the issues on the table, let's say. Then we will have the remaining part of the webinar for discussion. So thank you, Patrick, for being today with us. We are very happy to host this webinar, and I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to present some thoughts on mobility in the frame of the ICARUS project, and I would like to thank the organizers, and specifically I would like to thank Eleonora too and Lucio Rubini for the exchanges we had before this seminar. There are two PowerPoints available actually. There is a long one. That was the PowerPoint asked by the organizers a few weeks ago. Actually, it was back in February. And it was a PowerPoint written in respect to what was expected at that time. And there is a new version of it, which is shorter, so we'll have time for questions after the presentation. And of course, it's also a PowerPoint which takes into account what we have lived the last weeks, the last months, and all that the COVID-19 may have changed. So I will be quite short, and in this slide and the next one, I just want to tell you what I would have planned to say 2 or 3 months ago. So if you're interested in these points, you may refer to the full PowerPoint, or you may ask questions after the presentation. I was first asked to identify the main external trends that influence mobility and that influence transportation. And for me, the biggest trends, or we could speak of mega trends, that was, for example, urban changes, the fact that planning and urban planning, transport planning are more and more together. And we know now that the way we plan cities and territories have a big influence on the way we move. Then there is, of course, the ecological transition. We'll come back to that issue. That's all the issue behind the reduction of the ecological footprint and all the negative externalities of transport. Socio-demographic changes, the demand is changing, lifestyles are more diverse, the population is aging, and so that's also an issue for mobility and transport. Technological changes, of course, the impact of digitalization, and finally governance, mainly if we speak about cross-border cooperation. And all these for me are mega trends, but they are external to the mobility system. They influence mobility, they influence the way we plan mobility and we plan transportation, but they are kind of external. There are long-term trends, and there is the sixth one, which I'm going to speak about today. That's the COVID-19, and I'm going to give you some thoughts about the way it will impact, or it may impact, mobility. Then in a second part, I was asked to identify some trends and scenarios within the mobility system. And I would have spoken about the behavior changes, slow tourism, post-car world, and integrated mobility. But I think that given the context, I'm going to focus on one point, which is decarbonisation, or what we could call the transition towards a low carbon mobility. When we speak about carbon, that's a way to summarize all the challenges of mobility, because carbon is related to air pollution, it's related to noise, of course, to the emission of CO2, so it's related to global warming. It's based on carbon resources, so it's also related to the issue of resources depletion. So carbon maybe is the key when we speak about mobility. And we have several ways to see how the transition towards low carbon mobility could happen. But I think it's quite important to see that there are three main ways to imagine this transition. That's a little bit artificial to distinguish these three ways, but I think it's important to do that in respect to the debate and in respect to the current situation. The first way to imagine the transition towards a low carbon mobility, we can summarize it by a single word, which is improve. Basically, that's technological solution or technological fix. The idea is that we can make the current transportation system more efficient. And by doing so, we can reduce its environmental impact. So as I said, that's technological solution. Of course, that's the example of the electrification of cars. It's also all the ideas of autonomous cars, smart cars. It can also be, for example, the apps to share car parking spots in a more efficient way, for example. When we have this idea of improvement, we do not address the causes of mobility. There is no fundamental change, actually. And that's also maybe it's quite attractive for politicians and also for many of us.
Sorry to interrupt, Patrick. Yeah. I think your slides have frozen. So I don't know if you're scrolling.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, now it's perfect. Sorry. Thank you.
You haven't seen the other ones?
No, unfortunately, I think we missed them.
Sorry. Sorry for that. So yes, this first scenario, and I think that's the key point here, is the idea of improvement. And well, as I said before, it does not address the causes of mobility, just say that we can improve it. Who may be the key actors in such a scenario? That would be the private sectors. It would be, for example, car manufacturers, or it would be big companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, and so on. There are some risks with this scenario. That's the risk of rebound effects. We know that when we have more possibility to be mobile, actually we become more mobile. So that may an issue. And also it doesn't solve everything. If we speak about the e-cars, well, it doesn't solve the issue of space consumption in cities, and it doesn't solve the issue, or partly only, of energy production. Can you see the second point here?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, the shift.
The second part, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So the second way to imagine the mobility transition is summarized by the word shift. So that's the usual, that's a well-known word. It's the modal shift. The idea is to transfer users from cars and motorized traffic to public transportation and to active mobility. That is to say, walking, cycling, and also e-cycling. There are several tools to do that. It may be related to financial incentives, to transport infrastructures, such as bicycle networks. It may be related to public transportation, like the timetable and the quality of the supply, and also mobility as a service. But it's also related to mobilities outside transport. And actually, there is a considerable potential to influence travel through non-transport policies, such as land use planning. Who are the key actors here? That's public authorities, local authorities, regional authorities, and national authorities. The idea is to say we can more or less keep the same lifestyles, but we can change the way we move. So it doesn't address the reasons why we travel, but it addresses the way how we travel. And then we have a third vision, which is summarized by the word avoid. In French, we have the word also démobilité. It would be like demobility, or in English, or demobilità, maybe in Italian. And it goes a little bit forward. It's the idea of reducing the need for mobility. It's to avoid some trips. It's also to avoid rush hours, for example, or it's to reduce distances. So in this way, we focus more on proximity rather than distance and speed and efficiency. It's a redefinition of lifestyles, maybe with new values, like less is better, the idea of slowing down. We may have some examples like the slow city, or cheetah slow. That's the 15-minute city or 20-minute city. You may have heard of that. It's the idea to plan cities, neighborhoods, villages, so that most of the amenities are accessible by foot or by bike within 15 or 20 minutes. It's also the idea of proximity tourism, for example. It's more difficult to explain. When I presented that 3 months ago to my students, I had to try to find a good example to explain that. I remember having taken part to a roundtable with an economist, and he said, "Oh, I like the first scenario. I can model it quite easily. The second one is also fine, but the third one, well, that's interesting, but we can't quantify that." And yes, it's more difficult, but what is interesting in it is that it raises the question of why we are mobile. What is the meaning of mobility? And of course, in this period of the COVID-19, we had to avoid mobility. So we went, or we are in that direction, although it was constrained, and it's not a choice. So I'm going to speak a little bit about what can we learn from this period. We can also represent these kind of scenarios in a sustainable transport hierarchy. So you can see here the scale, what is the best, what is the most efficient for sustainability, and what is the worst. The best would be demand reduction, so it's the avoid, modal shift. The third would be efficiency improvement, and the last one, which I've not spoken yet, is like business as usual. Business as usual is if we have a problem of congestion, we increase the capacity, and we don't really think much about it. And I think that what we don't want is actually more cars on the road. And I think that this fourth scenario should be at least put aside. If we have a look at, that's the hierarchy according to sustainability. If we have a look at the hierarchy in terms of current policies, actually that's just the opposite. The Mobile Life Forum did a worldwide survey to see what was the content of policies, mobility and transportation policies in several metropolis around the world. And actually, what is the most common is capacity increases and then improvement, which is still dominant when we speak about transition. Shift is very secondary, and avoid is almost not present. It's a kind of a taboo, and we don't really speak about it, at least in policy documents. Then if we go to the current time of the COVID-19, what are the impacts of the pandemic? Well, that's a difficult question, and I have to say that it's highly speculative, and I don't have any certain ideas. So it's really mobility under uncertainty, to repeat the title of the presentation. It's because the impacts of the COVID-19 will depend on many factors. It will, of course, depend on the evolution of the pandemic. Will there be a second wave? Will there be a medicament, a vaccine? And if so, when? When we speak about the impacts, we have to distinguish between the short, medium, and long terms. And we have to distinguish as well between the type of mobility. Maybe commute will kind of recover quite soon, while tourism will need more time. I think that the World Organization of Tourism spoke about a return to the kind of normal as far as tourism is concerned in 2024. What you can see here in the figure is just an example of what happened in Switzerland. That's the share of trips according to the length. What we don't see here is that the number of trips declined a lot, of course. But what I wanted to show is that the share of long distance journey from mid-March, that's the start of the semi-lockdown in Switzerland, long-term moves, long distance journeys decline quite quickly. People would travel, 1/3 of the journeys would be between 50 or at least 50 kilometers, and this kind of trips almost disappeared. And on the opposite, short distance trips became more important. So it was kind of a renewed importance of proximity. And again, the number of trips declined, and we don't see that. But I think that this idea of proximity is really important when we speak about the impacts of the COVID-19. And I want to show again this figure, because if we speak about the crisis and the mobility transition, I think a key issue is to think how much these two phenomena are converging or not. And what can we learn from the last weeks? What can we keep? Of course, we don't want to keep many things, but we have also to be cautious that measures should be in the first two dimensions and should not fall into the last category. So I have two main impacts of the COVID-19 to discuss. One is about demand reduction, and the other one is about modal shift. And if we speak about demand reduction, or what I called before demobility or demobilita, what we have witnessed is a decrease, of course, in the number and or in the length of journeys, of trips. Of course, that was compulsory, but there were a lot of home office or teleworking, we've been speaking about teleworking for decades, but I think that there's been a huge learning effect the last weeks. Proximity. Proximity has become important again. Maybe we tended to forget a little bit proximity, and with that there was a renewed attractiveness of walking and cycling. There was also a renunciation in many trips and in many leisures, in many journeys, only speaking about leisures or visiting friends and families. Reversed mobility has become quite important. What I mean by reversed mobility is people moving for someone else. It's the kind of, it's for example, delivery services or postal services. And I think we've seen quite a lot of increase in online shopping or a restaurant doing deliveries, for example. And what are the challenges now? It would be to keep what is desirable behind what we have lived the last weeks. We could observe an improvement in the air quality of cities, less noise, less CO2 emission, and I think that show maybe some ways to reach a better urban environment. And we could try to use not all the constraints, of course, but what was positive, like this rediscovery of proximity, and maybe to use more proximity as a planning principle, to speak about the access to amenities on foot, by bike, in a quite a short time, and it would be also to promote localized way of life. It's not to forbid the other way of life, but to make localized lifestyle quite attractive. And another one, the last point I wanted to raise, it's in terms of modal share. What will be the impact of the COVID-19? Will there be a long-term modal shift? How will this evolve? And I think that's important challenges for local, regional, and national authorities. A trend we have been able to observe is the increase in active mobility, increase in the share of walking and cycling. I think that many cities around the world, and it's at least the case of Rome and Milan, for example, but many examples of cities have applied what we call tactical urbanism. That's some temporary measures, temporary infrastructures, such as pop-up bike lane, extended pavement for pedestrians, extending public spaces, all this to guarantee physical distancing. And so we've seen this tactical urbanism. How can we extend these measures to maybe more cities, more territories? And on the medium and long term, how can we transform these short-term measures to kind of real infrastructures? Then there is a fear that is quite widespread among public authorities, is the potential of the revenge of the private car. We know that transit, and I'm going to speak about that in a few seconds. Maybe people want to avoid public transport, and they are likely to go back to the private car. And of course, that may be an interesting individual solution, but it's not an interesting social or global solution. And we know that the car provokes a lot of external environmental externalities, and noise, air pollution are also responsible for many premature deaths in our countries. So there is a challenge how to limit car traffic and not to change a health challenge with another one. The third point related to modal shift, that's the fear of public transport. And I would also mention the fear of shared mobilities, car sharing, carpooling, maybe also bike sharing. And it's a strange time because maybe for the first time, we ask people not to use public transport or to use them differently. So it's really a change of discourse that is really important. And the challenge is how to improve the trust in public transport, because people are kind of afraid of taking them. They want to keep this physical distancing. And how will it be possible? And we start to see public transport companies who start to clean or to disinfect more regularly, several times a day, the vehicles. There are also some thoughts about the layout of vehicles. How can we arrange things so that people are a little bit less in contact? We speak about also desynchronization. Quite a lot of people travel or used to travel at the same time. That's the peak hours, rush hours. Can we flatten this curve? Can we make people travel at a different time of the day? That's quite a challenge as well. And also to say that crowding in public transport is not only related to vehicles, but also to stations, like tube station, train station as well. This shouldn't be forgotten. And finally, the last point in terms of modal shift, it's more related to tourism, which of course it's a big issue in Croatia and in Italy. That's the survival of air companies. What we can see is that, well, it's of course a very tough time for them, a very difficult time for them, and we're not sure that they will all survive. Most probably they won't all survive. And what are the impacts on tourism? I'm not really a specialist on tourism, as I work more on everyday mobility, but I think that we will see an increasing attractiveness of medium-range destinations, and maybe we will see also, when I speak of medium-range destinations, it's also destinations that you can reach by car or by train. So I think that the low-cost model within Europe will have a tough time. So that's also challenges, but maybe also opportunities for touristic destinations. So that's what I wanted to show you a little bit today, and to start with, to have this kind of element to present and to launch the discussion.
Hello. So thank you very much, Patrick, for your presentation. And of course, as I was saying before, we'll take questions from the audience if they have any. In the meantime, I had some questions that we collected prior to this presentation, from those partners who could not attend, partners of the ICARUS project. And actually, I think some of them are quite interesting to also hear from our audience and for you as well. I think the first one that I would like to ask you is actually very much related to what you were saying before, right? To the so-called revenge of the car, and the fact that there are many challenges. One of them is that, you know, in the past, especially, public authorities have worked a lot to improve and to give options to citizens and to inhabitants so that they can take some sustainable mobility path. So perhaps use more public transport or other active modes of transport. And actually, that is because we know that one of the main problems with transportation is because usually private and public interests are not aligned. And usually, you know, we have private behavior that produces some negative externalities, which then the public part has to deal with. So, for example, I may decide to go downtown, which has a lot of restrictions in terms of access and high cost of parking, still using my car. This is just because I'm used to do that. So this is what actually we also call the status quo bias, right? We tend to keep our behavior and to remain, let's say, faithful to our past choices, even if new and possible more convenient choices would be available. And you know, so we have the status quo bias that you know, it has been a problem for many years, and now we've also have in addition the COVID situation, which may aggravate further this point. So people do not trust using public transportation or trains and so on. So we have several approaches to at least in the past, we have used different approaches to encourage people to use more sustainable transports. And for example, we have been promoting car sharing, social media. Also, we have looked at different policy measures and sustainable travel plans. And I think one of the questions that a lot of organizations and public authorities have, do you think this entire situation, how this will change due to COVID? Will this, let's say, strategies still be effective or not? Should we think about something different? How do you see, you know, the status quo bias and the COVID playing, you know, being together? So yeah, I guess this was the first question.
Yeah. Well, the status quo bias is an important trend when we speak about mobility and transportation. We know that people don't like to change, and I think that we are quite lazy. And when we speak about mobility usually is based on habits, on a routine. Once we have a behavior, a practice, we rarely change, except if we have if there is a big change in our lives, like a new job, a new dwelling, and maybe the birth of a child, or if there is an external pressure. And for me, the COVID was an external pressure, of course, but what is not clear is will there be a long-term effect? Will there be a second wave or not? Will there be a medicine, and it may change radically the impacts. But I think that we know that some policies work if we want to influence people. It's always the story of carrots and sticks, and carrots or nudged are fine, but sometimes we have to use the sticks. For example, in Switzerland, if we want to, what is the major predictor to explain why someone drives to work, why someone uses his car, her car, to go to work. It's not an issue of gender, it's not an issue of income, it's not an issue of place of residence or place of work. The main predictor, the main factor is is the employee sure to have an available car parking spot at the workplace? So we know that if we work on the number of car parking spots, we will influence people. Maybe not very popular, that's true, but it's quite effective. We did that, for example, in my university. 15 years ago, there were 12,000 students and member of staffs. Now it's 20,000. And the direction decided not to create an additional car parking spot. And the number of cars remains stable. But so there is the idea of carrot and sticks, but there is another one, is you have to be sure that other behavior, other practices are possible. And I think that we can change things, but we have to use carrot, sticks, and alternatives. And maybe also, till now, when we speak about transportation, we speak mobility. People have to be able to be mobile. And maybe we should speak less of mobility and more of accessibility. What is important, it's not really the way people move, but to be sure that everyone can access workplaces, shopping places, leisures. And maybe people want to reach activities. They care a little bit less about the way they move around.
Yeah, that's very right. Actually, talking about different solutions that are in place, you know that ICARUS, as well as other initiatives, have a strong focus on technology and also on journey planning. Actually, we have seen the rise of apps that try to either predict the way you move or also suggest how you should be moving in the most, let's say, effective way, and also to organize your journey effectively. And in these apps, you can see there are often many default options, which obviously you can change. For example, in Google Maps, you can decide whether you want to use the highway or not. There could also be, for example, a sustainable mode option that could perhaps influence the way people move. And that way, perhaps people could receive information about their journey. So, for example, the fuel consumption in terms of economic value, or some other form of monetization of their trip. Actually, for example, also in Italy, on the train ticket, at one point there was the indication of your CO2 emissions, based, or the emissions that you would save by doing that journey instead of another. So do you think this kind of techniques or apps would be helpful in sort of the transition towards more sustainable mobility, or do you see any risks, benefits, more risks than benefits, or yeah, what's your opinion on that?
I think that such apps would be very useful, very helpful. They may be not enough, but I think that even though we travel and we move every day, actually we don't know much about our mobility. And for example, car drivers tend to overestimate the duration of a journey made by public transport or by bike, or they tend to underestimate how expensive a car is. So I think that information can be useful. And well, CO2, health benefits, physical activity, because we don't know that. I wouldn't be able to tell you how much CO2 is a flight from Paris to London, for example, and I should know that because it's an import. But if we don't provide this information, people they're too lazy, or it's not their role to look for all this information. So I think that would be part of local authorities or providers. And we've seen quite a lot of cities trying to do that. For example, you have a metro maps with, and you add the number of meters between two stations, because you know that a lot of people want to go there, and maybe it's just easier if they get out and walk for 5 minutes. And the French city of Bordeaux did that as well, because they realized that many people actually take the bus or the tram just for 2 or 3 stops. And 2 or 3 stops, it's not a big deal to walk. And you have to explain people that it's in terms of number of steps or minutes, because they don't really know about distances. So I think information can be useful. It may be apps, but it might also be low-tech, like posters or maps, paper maps, or a poster on the wall. Apps is fine, maybe it's more fun, but there are also other ways. And I think what is needed is also a trigger. You don't, information is one thing, but you have to make people experiment a new way. For example, I did a research on the bike to work action in Switzerland. Between 2 months, you can try to cycle to work, and you see how it goes. And it's based on teams, so that there is a kind of pressure or competition or help between participants, and people learn. And you have to give opportunity, information, and then opportunity, I would say.
Yeah, I think that kind of experiments or tests have been made in different countries, and have shown that indeed, if you have, let's say, a combination of social pressure or need enough time to try out a new way of transport, you may discover the benefits and not leave them. We have a question from the audience, so perhaps I can share it with you. So we have been asked, so how do you see the role of flexible transport in getting people back to public transport in post-COVID time? And do you think this is an option for the future?
About public transport? I forgot.
No, the question is about flexible transport. So I think this person is referring perhaps to demand responsive and flexible transport services.
Yes, well, I think it's the same issue than kind of traditional or usual public transportation, is the idea of disinfecting and cleaning. And for me, it's the same also than car sharing. Car sharing is also kind of on-demand mode of transport. You can book a car and this. And I think that people need to trust this mean of transport and to know that they are safe using them. So it may be related to disinfecting, cleaning, or what is important for people? Is it to wear specific gloves, maybe to wear the mask, or to have some disinfecting tissues? And because I think that flexible transport has been proven to be a solution in some places.
Thank you. I had one last question, but I think I will leave the floor to Lucio, because we are running out of time, and I know Lucio has also some interesting inputs. So I will just leave that for next time if we manage to see each other, Patrick.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Patrick, also for your presentation, especially the slide with the hierarchy type of scale it's very useful to match the current challenges comparing to this scale. How to put each challenge on the level of the scale. It's very useful for having a very short summary of the questions. My comment is more generic, let's say, and it's the perspective of the policymakers in this next short future, let's say. I think that this emergency is showing us that things can change very, very fast from day to another. And I think that the planning discipline could, should, must reshape a lot the approach. Because I'm thinking to the SAMP paradigm, to the planning, in which we define the city of the future in a long-term view. We plan the city of 2030, for example. I think that this emergency is showing us the need to plan not even the city of tomorrow, but to intervene in an urgent way to the city of today. And I think that the part you mentioned that are all the temporary measures that the city are adopting, such as the pop-up cycling lanes and so on, is moving up a necessary approach, which is the, learn by doing policy, let's say. And what is the tactical urbanism that the book from the two famous urban plan, Leiden and Garcia in 2015, the motto under the title of the tactical urbanism was short-term action for long-term change. Mm-hmm. I think that the sense of short-term action should strongly be more considered in the planning discipline. The topic of testing measure, the topic of adopting pilot to test the reaction of the city, the reaction of the citizen, to adopt step by step. So less modelization, let's say, of the city, more practical intervention, more short-term policies for a long-term change. Mm-hmm. I think that it's totally necessary, new paradigm in the discipline of the planners and in the perspective of the policymakers. And especially, I think my first question, if you agree on this view, and the other point is that the necessary of speed up the process of the policy decision-making process is that in this short-term policy, when the citizens are involved, because you see that from my experiences, the long process in the SAMP adoption is also because the involvement of people is very time-consuming. It takes a lot of time, the due time. And how to combine the necessary of taking decision day by day from not the bottom-up approach, but the top-down, and how to involve people in this new approach on the planning.
Mm. Well, thank you. Well, it's true that planning has become more complex. It's not just to provide, dwellings and transport infrastructures. It's global change, it's social equity, it's public health. So it's quite complex, and it's also fascinating for us working in that field. I agree with you, and I agree with the fact that we have to combine short-term and long-term. What we can say as well is that when we speak about the 2030 city, actually the 2030 city is already here. It's Switzerland. The number of new dwellings we build each year, it's about 1% of the housing stock. So basically, we change just a small bit each year. So basically, not everything, but almost everything is already here. So we know what we're going to have, not everything, but most of it in 10 years, for example. And given the current challenges and this uncertainty, complexity, I think we need also to be more agile. So to have also blueprints, plan, projects, that the usual tool of planning. But we need also more flexible, more agile modes of intervention. And I think that's what is interesting with the tactical urbanism. And that's related to mobility, but it may refer to other issues. And it's not that expensive, and we can try. And if it fails, it's not a big issue. We can go back. But I think that at least in Switzerland, that's very difficult to convince politicians. Maybe we have a quite strict system, and that's difficult to speak about improvisation and tactics and experimentation. But I do think it's a key issue. I'm part of a federal committee whose role is to advise the federal government and the federal administration, and that was one of our key points, actually. And of course, we have to involve people, and we have also to know their needs, but to interpret them. As I said before, maybe people don't want to drive to the center. What is important is people want to access easily the center. People want to have to go to work. They want to visit their friends. They want to have some leisures. And what we have to do as planners is to make that possible, but to make it in a more sustainable way. So to take people into account and to translate, to interpret the needs in a sustainable way. But that's a big challenge.
Yeah. It's also an issue for the European project adopting this kind of pop-up approach to the things. I mean, we are used to think a project that probably will start in 2 years and it will end in the next 3 years. So it's a very long-term planning of everything. And I think that also in this scope of the project, European level should reshape somehow the horizon of action. Thank you, Patrick. Eleonora, what do you think? We are an hour of webinar right now. If we could collect some question, if any, from the audience.
Yeah, I think that for today, perhaps our time is over, although we have a lot of interesting insights and actually inputs for discussion. Maybe you should organize another webinar with Patrick. But yeah, so I don't think there is any more question from the audience. So I will just leave the floor to Patrick and Lucio if you want to close the session with some final consideration.
Yeah.
And then we can close the webinar.
I would, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Rerat, for this webinar, for the time with us. And I think that this could be an interesting opportunity for putting some points during the discussion that we are doing day by day. And I take this opportunity also for presenting the next one webinar that we are within the ICARUS project. I don't.
Lucio, we are having problem with the audio, so we cannot hear you.
Know if I have the chance of now.
Okay, now we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but
no.
Okay, well,
okay.
Perhaps
and
Patrick,
just please, Eleonora.
Okay, maybe if Patrick, you want to go ahead, then maybe I can later on anticipate what Lucio wanted.
Well, as you can see, it's quite difficult to give a webinar. I'm sorry also for my own technical problems. I hope that you could follow what I wanted to say. And anyway, you have the PowerPoint, which is available or which has been sent around. I'd be happy to discuss and debate if you want via emails. And otherwise, yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I wish you good luck for the next steps of the ICARUS project, which sounds fascinating.
Great, lovely, thank you. And yeah, I think that on behalf of all our attendees and also from the ICARUS partnership, we would also like to thank you, because your presentation was full of very interesting insights. And I think definitely when you start talking about mobility, there is always so much to say, and you know, it's such a wide topic. But you know, especially in this specific time, mobility is particularly relevant, and it's good to hear about you know, opinions and research that you have conducted during your career. So thank you very much. And I don't know if Lucio, you
now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Eleonora, just for launching the new webinar. Next one. I don't actually if I can share my screen, but we can just say that the next one will be on the 19th of June. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, good. The next webinar will be 29th of June, and the topic will be more or less starting by the topic of today, but we will have the opportunity of discussing the role of the public transport, in particular, the role of the public transport provider in the challenges of the COVID-19. We will have two speakers, Professor Giovanni Longo from the University of Trieste and Giuseppe Zottis, who is the operation manager of Trieste Trasporti, that is the public transport provider of the city of Trieste. The format will be the same, so it will be 1 hour of webinar, mixing question, discussion, and so on. That's all from my side.
All right, so we hope that a lot of people will be able to take part, and they will find the next webinar interesting, and of course that they found this one interesting and relevant for their activity. So again, thank you so much everyone for taking part. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Lucio. Also, obviously, to all the partners of the ICARUS project and to your university. Thank you, and have a nice evening. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.